and welcome to the FW de Klerk Foundation's Constitution at Work podcast. I'm Daniela Ellerbeck. I am an attorney and manager of the Foundation's Constitutional Rights Program. Today's podcast is the fourth in our series on electoral reform. Joining me today is my colleague, Ismail, the Foundation's Constitutional Advancement Program Manager, as well as the Foundation's two interns, Nkandu and Sonia Twongyeirwe. Today, we have the privilege of discussing the history of South Africa's electoral system with David Steward, the Foundation's Chairman Emeritus and the DG in former President de Klerk's office. Now, South Africa's current electoral system is a story of dramatic change, from an exclusionary, racially engineered system during the colonial and apartheid eras to our modern democratic framework built on the principles of universal adult suffrage and proportional representation. Now, this transition was marked most notably by our historic 1994 elections, and this was also solidified by our final constitution in 1996, as well as in subsequent laws such as the Electoral Act, which most recently included even independent candidates running for public office. So Dave, welcome. Can you explain the key changes in South Africa's electoral system since the end of apartheid in 1994?
Yes, the previous constitution was the 1983 Tricameral Constitution, and it comprised three houses: the House of Assembly, which had 166 members and I think 10 appointed members, and then that was for white South Africans. And then we had the House of Representatives, which had 85 members altogether, 80 elected and 5 appointed. That was for colored South Africans. And then there was the House of Delegates, which had 45 members, 40 elected, 5 appointed. And the idea was that each of these houses would deal with the own affairs of the communities involved. And then when there were issues of common interest, they would come together in plenary and decide on the future of the country. Now, there are problems with this. First of all, neither the colored community nor the Indian community wanted this. So this was an artificial parliament, still based on racial lines, which in effect was unacceptable, not only to the two communities, the coloureds and the Indians, but also, of course, to black South Africans, because no provision was made at all for black South Africans in the 1983 Constitution. The big change, however, between the 1983 Constitution and the 1993 Interim Constitution and the 1996 Final Constitution was that before 1994, Parliament was supreme. It could and did adopt any legislation that it liked. The courts were impotent. They could only pass judgment on the bona fides of a piece of legislation or procedural matters. So the courts had very limited ability to adjudicate on the constitutionality of any of the acts of Parliament. And the biggest change from that system to the new system, apart of course from the fact that the new system represented all South Africans, was that the new Parliament was not sovereign. It was bound by the Constitution. So those were the main changes between the old system and the new system. The previous one did not enjoy legitimacy because it was not representative of all of the people of the country by any means. And it was dangerous because it gave untrammeled power to Parliament. Now, all of that changed with the 1993 Constitution and the 1996 Constitution.
So, Dave, what were the major historical milestones that led from this exclusionary apartheid-era electoral system to the inclusive democratic framework we see in South Africa today?
The analogy that we always used about the 80s was that the white National Party was riding a tiger. The rest of the world was shouting at the riders of the tiger, "Get off." But of course, the problem with getting off a tiger is making sure you don't get eaten. And so in a way, the tricameral parliament was an attempt by TPW to sort of gingerly take 1 foot off the target. But of course, that didn't work. The only thing that happened was that the reforms that he introduced, which were quite far-reaching in abolishing quite a lot of apartheid legislation, created immense expectations, which fueled countrywide disputes and protests led by the UDF. And this resulted in a huge crisis in the mid-1980s in South Africa of ungovernability, growing isolation, border wars in southern Angola, Mozambique, which were really posing a great threat to the society, economic collapse. All of these factors led, I think, to the situation that all parties, the ANC government, accepted by about 1987 there could not be a revolutionary or a military solution, that there would have to be negotiations. And the first contacts were made by FW de Klerk's government to Nelson Mandela, all very secret. And there were talks that were going on between South African businessmen, between academics and ANC groups in the latter part of the 1980s that started to prepare the way for the transition. And then a lot of things happened that, as we say in South Africa, turned the robot screen, in other words, the traffic light screen. All parties agreed there would have to be negotiations. And then in 1988, there was a tripartite agreement between Cuba, Angola, and South Africa on the withdrawal of Cuban forces from Angola. And this led to the independence of Namibia and to the withdrawal of Soviet influence from Southern Africa, which was the South African government's main strategic concern. So that traffic light turned green. The traffic light relating to negotiations was green. And then the fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November 1980 sent another green signal to people who wanted change. Another important development occurred on the 2nd of February 1989 when FW de Klerk was elected leader of the National Party after President PW Botha's surprise resignation. PW Botha wouldn't have been able to lead the transformation process, but FW de Klerk was able. And when all of these traffic lights went green, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the resolution of the conflict in Namibia and Angola, with the acceptance of the necessity for negotiations, he realized that the situation would never again be better for the commencement of negotiations. So on the 2nd of February 1990, he made a speech in Parliament in which he put everything on the table. He unbanned the ANC and other revolutionary parties. He announced the imminent release of Nelson Mandela. He said that the door to negotiations was open. And that started the transformation process, which would last until the adoption of the interim constitution in December 1993, and of course our first fully democratic election on the 27th of April 1994. It was a roller coaster ride. It was full of crises, problems, but we came through it in the end with one of the best constitutions in the world.
Dave, I'm so happy that you put it so eloquently in illustrating for us how South Africa got to the point of negotiations and then thereafter the transformation of South Africa. And speaking about negotiations, South Africa adopted a system of a clauseless proportional representation, which was one of the products of our negotiated transformation for both national and provincial legislatures. And under this system, political parties present lists of candidates and voters cast their ballots for parties rather than for individual candidates. Now, the seats in the legislature are then allocated to parties in proportion to the total number of votes each party receives. And the question then is, how did the negotiations specifically during South Africa's transition from apartheid influence the design and the adoption of the current proportional representation system?
Well, the electoral system in 1994 was determined through negotiations in the Transitional Executive Council, which played a very important role in leading the country between the adoption of the 1993 Constitution in December 1993 and the first election. So there was an independent electoral commission. There was a great deal of thought given to the kind of electoral system that we would need. It was agreed that it should be proportional and that this would be the fairest and easiest way of running the first election. But it was not intended that this would be the final electoral system of South Africa. So already in the 1996 Constitution, in section 46.2, provision was made that said that an act of parliament must provide a formula for determining the number of members of the National Assembly. And the idea was that that should have been in place for the 1999 election, but it wasn't. So the ANC government decided early on in the 2000s, I think 2002, to appoint a special commission to look into the whole question of the electoral commission situation. And that was the Vencel-Slabbert Commission, which I think reported in 2004. And it came up with the idea that it would still have to be proportional representation, but that there should be a much more direct relationship between voters and their MPs, because the essence of democracy is that the people should be represented directly in Parliament. And the Vencel-Slabbert Commission made provision for 400-member Parliament, National Assembly. 300 members would be elected in 69 multi-member constituencies. They broke it up into multi-member constituencies so that it wouldn't be just the first past the post who would win. And so you have the situation, for example, in the UK, where the Labour Party got 34% of the votes, but about 68% of the seats. So the idea was that this would not happen in multi-member constituencies. And then 100 members would be elected on a proportional basis. And also to make sure that rounding off would take place so that parties would end up proportionally with the right share of the votes. So that was the idea, but very sadly, it was just left on the shelf to gather dust.
Thank you so much, David, for highlighting how the negotiations took place. And given these negotiations, what were the main challenges that were faced during the transition to a fully democratic electoral system in 1994?
Well, there were enormous problems and crises during the negotiation period. And the main problem was escalating violence. Most of the 23,000 people who died of political violence between 1960 and 1994 actually died after the negotiations began. And there was a great deal of jockeying for position between political parties, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal. There was also unauthorized aggravation by elements in our security forces. So the biggest problem that FW de Klerk experienced during the negotiation was trying to control this violence and trying to find out who was responsible. And the first step in resolving this came with the National Peace Accord in September 1991, where all of the parties got together and agreed on codes of conduct, and in terms of which the Goldstone Commission was appointed to investigate all allegations of violence from whatever source. And the Goldstone Commission helped to calm the situation down, but throughout the negotiating period, there were extremists on both sides who didn't want a successful negotiated outcome and who did everything they could to undermine the process. So we had, for example, the assassination of Chris Hani on the 10th of April 1993. We had the far-right AWB crashing into the World Trade Center, trying to disrupt this process. Because in any peace situation, you will find extremists on all sides who don't want peace. And that was the biggest problem. Another major problem was the question of how the final constitution would be adopted and drafted. The minority parties insisted that we should have the constitution first and then the election, because they were very apprehensive that if the election took place first, the constitution then would not make any provision for their concern. And one of the most brilliant solutions to this problem came with the idea, okay, well then you'll have two constitutions. We'll negotiate first interim constitution, in terms of which first election will take place, and then the newly elected parliament in 1994 will have 2 years to draft the final constitution, but it will have to do so within the framework of 34 immutable values that will be included in the first constitution. So that gave the minority parties the assurance that their basic interests would be defended when the final constitution was drafted. And it was also decided that the final constitution would have to be approved by the newly appointed Constitutional Court to ensure that it complied with these 34 immutable principles. And that's what happened. The first draft of the Constitution was actually rejected by the Constitutional Court, and Parliament had to make the necessary amendments. Then the final version of the new Constitution was signed on the 10th of December 1996 by President Mandela and Chairperson.
The next question I have is on the current system. The introduction of the PR system in a newly democratic South Africa with a distinct history in terms of African countries, was it meant to be a temporary system?
It was indeed meant to be a temporary system. It was not supposed to extend beyond the 1999 election, and that is the reason why the Van Zyl-Slabbert Commission was appointed. The whole idea was that it would draft a better electoral system, one that would ensure a much closer relationship between the voters and the members of the parliament representing them. Because with the first system, the simple proportional system, you had a dangerous erosion of the division of powers in the state. Because MPs were answerable to the political parties that nominated, they were going to do the will of the political party, not necessarily the will of the people who voted for them. The idea that Van Zyl-Slabbert came up with was, no, we're going to make 3/4 of the members of parliament directly answerable to the voters. And we experienced serious problems later on in the new South Africa because of this failure to create a proper separation of powers. Parliament simply did not play its proper role in overseeing the activities of the executive. They didn't do that because they could be fired if they did anything that displeased the government. In terms of Section 47(3)(c) of the Constitution, if you lose your membership of the party that nominated you to Parliament, you're kicked out of Parliament. So this gave political bosses absolute control over their members. And it meant that when President Zuma went off the rails with state capture, Parliament just simply did not play the proper role it should have played in stopping the egregious acts that he committed.
I mean, that really does put it in perspective that this PR system that we have and have had since the country became a democracy was in fact only meant to be a temporary system due to the accountability problems it creates. What were the key reasons behind choosing a closed list PR system for national and provincial elections in the first place, as opposed to the other electoral models that were available?
It was simply because this was the first election in the new dispensation, and they wanted to make it as simple as possible. But the idea was it would not be the final electoral system.
So has the introduction of the PR system impacted political representation in South Africa positively or negatively?
I think the idea of overall proportional representative is excellent. Diverse country like ours. It's very important that all of our communities, however large or small they may be, should feel represented in the process by which they're governed. And proportional representation really does go a long way toward achieving that goal. Again, if you take first past the post systems like the United Kingdom, you can get one party attracting millions more votes than another party, but far fewer seats. So it means that in the British Parliament, minority interests are not represented to the same extent. So the idea of proportional representation, particularly in a multicultural country like South Africa, is the right approach. But it's a question of how you implement that and how you retain a direct relationship between voters on the ground and their representatives in Parliament, and how you can ensure that those representatives play their constitutional role in exercising oversight over the executive, because that just simply hasn't happened in South Africa. And it's not just me saying this, the Constitutional Court itself has castigated the National Assembly for failing to carry out this duty.
Thank you, Mr. Steward. We have discussed the principles behind the closed list proportional representation system and its impact on the political representation in South Africa, given its diversity. Could we discuss the differences between the electoral systems used for the national and municipal elections in South Africa?
Well, yes. There is, in fact, a much greater provision for direct representation at municipal level than there is at national and provincial level, because you can vote for your own ward councillor, member of the municipal government in your area. That does make a very big difference. And it, I think, means that the representatives elected directly to municipal governments have much greater relationship with their voters, because they know they can be turfed out if services aren't delivered.
So given the current system, how do we balance the need, or in what ways does the current system balance the need for broad and inclusive representation rather, but also with the demand for accountability of the elected officials, given the fact that in the system we vote for a party and not the individual, and the individual may feel the need only to now answer to the party as opposed to the citizens? What are the challenges that we still have in this regard?
Well, the answer is that our present situation doesn't make provision for the kind of accountability that is required by the Constitution. And there was a wonderful opportunity when the Electoral Act was amended a couple of years ago to make provision for the inclusion of independent candidates. But once again, Parliament missed the opportunity. Instead, it kept the present system with a few modifications, supposedly to make it possible to elect independent members, but which are entirely ill-suited even to the election of independent members. So we still have this challenge. And the best remedy would still be the kind of electoral system proposed by Van Zyl, and even the majority in the parliamentary committee that recently reported on the Electoral Act and that recommended that there should be constituencies and direct accountability between voters and the majority of MPs.
You just raised a very important topic there, which is the fact that independent candidates, so people who are not affiliated with a political party, can run in elections in this country. And I would like to know, one, was this always the case? Two, what happened to change this? And then three, how would you say this has influenced the political landscape in South Africa?
Well, the reason why this matter drew attention again was because of a case that was brought by an organization, New Nation, against the government, because it claimed that the current system did not make provision for independent candidates to stand in an election. And this case was rejected by the Western Cape High Court, but then subsequently approved by the Constitutional Court, which ordered the national government to adopt electoral reforms within 2 years to make provision for independent candidates to stand. And for this reason, an advisory committee was appointed. It issued a report. The majority said, no, we need a dramatic change to the electoral system to create constituencies where voters would have a direct relationship with the members of parliament representing them. But the government rejected this and said, no, we're going to change it as little as possible. And they came up with the idea that independent candidates were able to stand only in huge constituencies on a provincial scale. This was entirely unacceptable and entirely counterproductive. Reality is that independent candidates nearly always come from a community and not from a province. They can't compete against political parties on a provincial scale. They can compete in a particular constituency, but the government didn't want that, and so it didn't happen. And I don't think any independent candidates were elected. So once again, we failed, and we failed because political parties in power, in fact, all political parties, like to keep control over their MPs. Gives them power, but it's not what the Constitution requires.
And I'm so happy that accountability was mentioned, because indeed accountability forms part of the founding values of the Constitution. Now, looking at the PR system that we have currently, indeed, Dave, as you rightly mentioned, it was meant to provide stability and has been instrumental in managing the transition from a deeply divided society to a more inclusive society. But it was never meant to be permanent, as you said. And there are those today that in fact argue that the closed list PR system results in elected representatives being more accountable to political parties rather than to the people themselves. What would you say to this, Dave?
Well, I think our history sadly proves that that is the case. When the Zuma government went off the rails with state capture, it should have been Parliament that said no. Parliamentarians should have said, no, this is not constitutional. But because all of the members from the ruling party were answerable to their party leaders and not to voters, they refused to play that role. And so it brought about an erosion of the separation of powers. And in any functioning democracy, that is essential. You need a separation between the executive, between the legislature, and between the judiciary. And that just doesn't exist at the moment. In fact, I think the ideal would be to have the president directly elected by the people as well, as it is in the United States. So there's also a tension between the president and the legislature, and both of them having to comply with a constitution enforced by an independent constitutional court. That's what you need if you want to avoid abuse of power, and that should be a goal of any effective constitution.
Thank you, Mr. Steward, for reflecting on the evolution of South Africa's electoral system. What do you consider its greatest successes, and what ongoing challenges does the country face in ensuring a truly representative and effective democracy?
Well, the average life expectation constitution is 17 years. And an historian did an analysis of global constitutions and found out that there have been 900 constitutions, more or less, since the adoption of the American Constitution in 1789. So the fact that our Constitution is still there, that it is still robust, that we still have an independent constitutional court that is not frightened of striking down unconstitutional actions and legislation, I think is one of the reasons that we remain a successful democracy. So that, I think, is the greatest achievement. And we must give government credit, too, because government obeys, however reluctantly it might be, the instructions of the Constitutional Court. Another very heartening thing about our system is that a small movement like New Nation can go to the Constitution and complain about something that is wrong in our society, and that Constitutional Court, if it agrees, supports them, and the government then, however reluctantly, must obey. So that, I think, is one of the key successes of our new system.
I had a question about the closed list proportional representation system. I would consider it a limited form of democracy, but I do wonder if it undercuts the will of the people to decide, for example, who the president can be, and it bars them from making that decision for themselves. So can you explain how this system aligns or diverts from South Africa's ideal of a robust democracy?
Well, South Africa is a democracy, but it has a flawed electoral system for the reasons that we've already discussed. The preference would be for, in my opinion, for the president to be elected directly. But the fact is that in terms of the current system, the leader of the successful party is almost invariably the new president. So there is that direct relationship between the voters and the new government in the broader perspective. So the new government also then has a mandate from the voters, according to its party platform, to carry out policies in accordance with the promises it has made. That is also a positive reflection of a genuine democracy. But there are great weaknesses, because in this system, Parliament is not playing the oversight role that it should be playing, and there is not a sufficiently direct relationship between voters and their representatives. So, yes, we've made great progress. No, it's still far from perfect.
Well, I would be remiss if I did not point out a very interesting fact, and that's the fact that the majority of the people on this podcast are, in fact, young people, the youth. And today we see that young people in South Africa are stepping up in ways that has never been seen before. And young people feel the sense of urgency to empower themselves and to take ownership of their future. And so, Mr. Steward, my question to you then is, what avenues are available for young people to participate in and hopefully to own the debate around electoral reform in South Africa?
Well, I think young people must acquaint themselves with the very extensive rights and powers that they enjoy in terms of the Constitution. They have freedom of expression. They should use that in order to express their views and their preferences, public platforms on the internet. They have the right to political participation. They have the right to form parties and become parts of movements. Find out which party best reflects your wishes, your vision for the future, and work for it. Become actively involved in the community, become actively involved in the broader society. I think it was Heracles who said that we have no time for those who have no interest in politics, because he could assure them that politics will have an interest in them. And that is why we should make full use of all of the rights and powers that are extended to us, assured to us in the Constitution. Also the right to demonstrate, also the right to picket, also the right to strike. All of these are powers that put real authority in the hands of the people, but they're effective only if the people use them.
That is a very powerful answer, and I hope that our young viewers take it to heart. To end off our podcast, I have one last question for you. Was the concept of independent candidates something that was even considered back in the negotiations when the Constitution and the electoral system was being negotiated? Because if one looks at independent candidates, then a PR system doesn't make provision for that. It's not a good fit for independence. But something like a first past the post, where people run in districts, would be. Was something like independent candidates, people that aren't affiliated to political parties, even something that was considered?
Well, I think that you would have had parties involved in negotiations that would have thought about that. And I think that's one of the reasons why Section 19.3 doesn't preclude independent candidates. But in the rush to adopt the Constitution, there was the anomaly that in practice, in other sections of the Constitution, it made it virtually impossible for independent candidates to stand in elections. So that was a glitch. But I think there would have been participants in negotiations who would have accepted the need for independence to be able to stand in elections.
Thank you so much for participating in today's podcast. It really was a very interesting history lesson in how we got our electoral system and how it was negotiated. To our viewers, thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video. Please remember to click like and subscribe below. Until next time.